And welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History, where we help believers understand the chaotic world they're living in with intelligent, faith-based perspectives of their times and the history that built those times. And we're continuing our deep dive American history podcast here, which we are calling The Empire, a 250-year American story. We're almost to the Civil War in this story, but I want to pause in our narrative today, and we want to look back at two groups of people who were not benefiting from all of the advance, all the growth that we've seen in the last few episodes, the first half of the 19th century. These are the others. Today we're going to be looking at what was going on with the American Indians amid all this spread of the Empire of Liberty, the Industrial Revolution, Manifest Destiny. While all of that's going on, what's going on with the American Indians? We'll turn to a second group in our next episode. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today. We're going to go ahead and just jump right in.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Now, in our earlier episodes, we already looked at the fact that long before the United States existed, North America was home to hundreds of American Indian nations, not tribes, but nations, that differed enormously in language, in religion, in government, in culture, from the powerful Iroquois Confederacy in the Northeast to the Cherokee towns of the southern Appalachians, from the horse-mounted Comanche of the Great Plains to the Pueblo peoples in the Southwest. American Indians occupied nearly every corner of the continent. They weren't a single people with a common identity. They were independent nations that forged alliances. They traded with one another. They fought wars. They negotiated treaties like European kingdoms did. And we kind of dropped off on that part of the story once we got to the age of the American Revolution. So let's start today and kind of pick up on what all is happening here, what all's been happening in the interim with the American Indians during this time period. By 1700, European colonization had already transformed the world of the American Indians. Diseases introduced by Europeans had devastated many tribes during the previous 2 centuries, while the arrival of firearms, the arrival of horses, manufactured goods, those all altered the balance of power across the continent. But even at that, American Indians remained the dominant military and political force over much of North America. European colonies survived only because they learned to cooperate with, or maybe successfully fight against, on occasion, their Indian neighbors. That's the reality of the story before 1700, right? Relations between European and American Indians, they were never simply peaceful or violent. It wasn't as black and white as that. They were driven by shifting political interest. Tribes often allied themselves with whichever European empire best served their own goals. Just as Britain and France competed for control of North America, American Indian nations competed with one another for control. They competed with one another for territory, for trade, for influence. And that's the way nations work. And so we have to get rid of the image that the American Indians were like cavemen or something like that. People just living off the land, unsophisticated. That's not the truth at all. These were sophisticated nations, sometimes even empires, who had been devastated by plagues of disease in recent centuries, and they were trying to rebuild themselves. One example of this strategic diplomacy came during the French and Indian Wars. If you'll remember, that was at the mid-mark of the 18th century, 1754 to 1763. It was the North American theater of the global 7 Years' War. That's what the Europeans called it. We've looked at this a little bit already. Despite its name, the conflict was not a war between the French and American Indians. The French and Indian War, it pitted Britain and its colonies against France and many of France's American Indian allies at the time. Most tribes didn't fight out of loyalty to either European empire. They chose sides based upon which alliance they believed would best preserve their independence and make them stronger, make them more powerful. Many tribes in the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley preferred the French because French settlements tended to consist of trading posts and missionary communities rather than large farming colonies like those of Britain. British colonists, by contrast, continually poured westward in search of farmland. For many American Indian leaders, the greatest threat was not British soldiers, but British settlers, whose permanent towns steadily consumed the Indian hunting grounds. The French cultivated long-standing relationships with tribes such as the Ottawa, the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, the Huron. They did all this through trading and through diplomacy. Warriors from these nations became essential allies in the fighting. They served as scouts and raiders. They served as guides whose knowledge of the forest often determined the outcome of different campaigns. The British, meanwhile, they attached support of portions of the Iroquois Confederacy, although even the Haudenosaunee, they often attempted to remain neutral for as long as possible. The Confederacy, this Iroquois Confederacy, had spent decades balancing European rivals against one another, using diplomacy to preserve its own influence. Their strategy reflected remarkable political sophistication that we don't often attribute to the Indians when we look back from our gaze hundreds of years later. That for the Iroquois Confederacy, rather than becoming subjects of European empires, they sought to manipulate imperial competition to strengthen themselves. So American Indian warfare, it also shaped the character of the conflict. They would raid villages, ambush supply columns, attack isolated settlements. Those all became common features of frontier life during the French and Indian War. Native warriors frequently targeted civilian communities that supported enemy armies, while colonial militias responded in kind by destroying Indian towns and food supplies. Violence, of course, spread across the frontier, and it created cycles of revenge that lasted for generations, one against the other, tit for tat, right? So we have to understand that American Indians, they weren't just passive observers caught between European powers. That's not what this story is. That's not the reality. They exercised agency. They pursued their own strategic objectives, and sometimes they initiated attacks designed to strengthen their own position. Some campaigns resulted in brutal massacres of frontier settlers, while colonial expeditions retaliated by burning villages, burning crops. And this war became increasingly vicious precisely because every participant believed survival depended upon eliminating future threats. Britain's eventual victory in 1763 against the French dramatically altered the balance of power. France surrendered nearly all of its North American possessions east of the Mississippi River. And overnight, many American Indians, many American Indian nations, they just lost their strongest European ally. For tribes of the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley, the consequence became immediately apparent. British officials proved less interested in maintaining the elaborate gift-giving diplomacy that had characterized French relations. Even more alarming, British settlers began moving westward. These would be the future Americans, right? They began moving westward in ever greater numbers into the territory of these Indian nations. So resistance soon erupted. An Ottawa leader named Pontiac, this is real famous. He organized one of the most significant coalitions of American Indians ever assembled against European expansion. Beginning in 1763, warriors from numerous tribes, they attacked British forts throughout the Great Lakes region. Several outposts fell while frontier settlements were abandoned, even as violence continued to spread across the interior of the North American continent. Pontiac's war, it ultimately failed to drive the British from the region, but it forced the British government to recognize that unchecked Western settlement threatened endless war. As long as the European settlers, the future Americans on the East Coast, on the Atlantic coast, were moving westward, there's always going to be this endless warfare. So in response, King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, if you remember from an earlier episode, this is what triggered the imperial crisis before the American Revolution. The Proclamation of 1763 angered many American colonists more than it satisfied American Indians. Thousands of settlers had hoped to claim Western lands after helping the British defeat France. Instead, the Crown attempted to reserve much of the interior as Indian territory in order to stabilize that frontier. So many colonists, they just ignored the proclamation altogether. And the tension here revealed a fundamental conflict that would define the next century of American history. Britain viewed Western settlement as a problem to be managed. American colonists increasingly viewed westward expansion as both an economic opportunity and a birthright. It's the seeds of manifest destiny that we've talked about right there. American Indians understood exactly what this American growing population meant. Every new settlement represented more forest cleared, It represented more game being driven away, more treaties demanding land cessions, and fewer opportunities for the Indian nations to remain independent. Now, their fears were not abstract. The population of Britain's American colonies had exploded from only a few 100,000 in the early 18th century to nearly 2 million on the eve of the American Revolution, and that growth really showed no signs of slowing. So even before the United States declared its independence, many American Indian leaders, they had concluded that the greatest long-term threat to their nations didn't come from European soldiers, but from the relentless expansion of American settlement itself. And ultimately they were right. The French and Indian War, it had removed the one imperial power capable of checking Britain's colonies. So in doing that, this war unintentionally cleared the path for the rise of an even larger republic whose appetite for land would prove unlike anything North America had ever witnessed. Over the next 90 years, that republic would expand from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific Ocean. And along the way, American Indians would resist, they would negotiate, they would adapt, they would ally, they would assimilate, sometimes they would even prosper. But they would also discover that the ambitions of the growing United States increasingly left little room for independent Indian nations to survive within its expanding borders. So from this perspective, the American Revolution, it wasn't just a struggle between Britain and its 13 colonies. For American Indians, this war represented something far more certain by the time it came along. It was a civil war among Europeans. It was a civil war that threatened to transform the already unstable balance of power that had existed for generations. The outcome would determine whether Indian nations continued dealing with a distant empire that attempted, however imperfectly, to limit Western settlements, or with an independent republic whose citizens seemed to eagerly seek their land beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Now, most American Indian leaders quickly recognized that the conflict wasn't primarily about liberty, not for them anyway. Instead, it was about who would control the frontier. For many tribes, the British Proclamation of 1763, it still meant something. It still remained significant. Although thousands of settlers ignored it, the British government at least acknowledged that Indian lands deserved legal protection. And many American colonists, by contrast, they regarded the proclamation as an intolerable obstacle to expansion. The influential Virginians like George Washington, like Patrick Henry, they had invested heavily in Western lands, and they hoped independence would remove British restrictions. American Indians, their leaders, they saw these ambitions with growing alarm, growing concern. So as a result, the majority of the Indian tribes east of the Mississippi, they either supported Britain or they attempted to just remain neutral. But few of them joined the side of the Americans. The British, needing every available ally, encouraged these partnerships by supplying them weapons and trade goods throughout the war. So the American Revolution became another brutal frontier war from this perspective. This is a side of the fighting you don't often hear about. The Cherokee, under leaders like Dragging Canoe, that was his name, launched coordinated attacks against frontier settlements in the southern backcountry around what we know as Tennessee today. Dragging Canoe had long argued that peaceful accommodation with the colonial settlers was impossible. Every treaty seemed only to invite more encroachment. When older Cherokee leaders accepted land cessions, he rejected their decisions and led thousands of followers farther west into Tennessee, where they continued fighting for the next 2 decades, almost 2 decades. The conflict here was devastating for both sides. Cherokee and allied warriors, they attacked isolated settlements, they killed civilians, they destroyed homes, and in response, American militia, they invaded Cherokee territories, burning dozens of towns and systematically destroying cornfields, orchards, and livestock. They weren't merely punitive raids. They were designed to cripple entire communities by eliminating the food supplies needed to survive the coming winter. Keep in mind the unintended consequences here. These were the lands in times when a young boy by the name of Andrew Jackson was growing up. His perspective of the Cherokee and American Indians in general was being painted by news and stories of these events that were happening all around him. A similar pattern was unfolding across the Ohio Valley. The Shawnee, the Miami, the Delaware, other nations, they increasingly viewed American independence as a direct threat to their own existence. Frontier warfare, marked by ambushes, by raids and reprisals, massacres committed by both American Indians and American settlers, was taking place. Neither side held a monopoly on the brutality here. Nobody was innocent in this fighting. Civilians often suffered the worst consequences as violence spiraled beyond the control of military commanders. The tragedy reached one of its darkest moments in 1782 in Gnadenhutten in present-day Ohio. We looked at this briefly in an earlier episode already, but when we discussed the Western theater of the American Revolution. It was here that an American militia murdered 96 Christian Delaware men, women, and children who had remained neutral in the conflict. These victims, they had actually converted to Christianity. They posed no military threat, but decades of frontier fear and revenge culminated in one of the most infamous massacres of the Revolutionary era. That's always to me one of the sadder type of, this happens repeatedly, I guess I should say that first, but it's one of the sadder aspects of these fightings between the Americans and the American Indians, when those American Indians had decided to surrender, had decided to give up, had decided to embrace the American way of life, the white man's way of life, Christianity, all of this stuff, and they would surrender, and then they still end up getting massacred. And this happened several times in the course of the stories of the American Indian. American Indians, they committed attacks themselves, right? They committed attacks that left deep scars on frontier communities. The 1778 Wyoming Valley Massacre in Pennsylvania, the 1780 raid on Kentucky's Blue Licks, they became enduring symbols of Indian warfare in American memory. While these events were often exaggerated in later frontier folklore, they still reflected the brutal reality that both settlers and American Indians increasingly viewed one another as existential enemies. The stories of these massacres, the fear, the dread they produced in the young and future generations of Americans, painted their image of the American Indians and set the stage for atrocities that would follow in later decades. When the revolution finally ended in 1783, the American Revolution, when it ended in 1783, American Indians faced a stunning betrayal. The Treaty of Paris recognized the independence of the United States and transferred enormous territories south of the Great Lakes and east of the Mississippi River to the ownership of the new American Republic. But no American Indian representatives participated in those negotiations. Britain simply ceded lands that it didn't actually control. They'd already proven that, but it ceded those lands it didn't actually control, and that land that belonged to independent Indian nations. Now, from the American perspective, this victory in the war had doubled the nation's size. From the perspective of many American Indians, Britain had totally abandoned them. And I think this is real important to recognize here. There is a perception being established that's subtle, but it's very definite right here at this point in history. You hear complaints and concerns that America has a white supremacy history. And I always kind of flinch at that, because when I hear it, I think of goofy white men wearing KKK costumes, burning crosses. That's not really accurate. That's not what it means. That's the black and white simple version of American racism and American history, right? It's a lot more subtle than that. The fact that no American Indians or their chiefs were included in the peace negotiations at the end of the Revolutionary War, even though their homelands were being discussed, were being assigned, that kind of reeks of injustice. Their homelands, the lands of their nations, became the property of another land, and they had no say in it. Not only did they have no say in these important matters, but they were just completely discounted as too unsophisticated, too juvenile, too inferior to be able to have a say. And that's how perspectives are built. That's how worldviews and prejudices and biases are built. And that's how I think it's difficult to argue that there's at least some truth to the idea of America having a white supremacy origin because of stories like these. But we'll get to that. We'll get to that in greater depth later on. The United States soon attempted to occupy the Ohio Valley. This was kind of like the treasure chest for a lot of the American Indians at the time. But the tribes living there refused to recognize American claims. They decided they were going to fight back. And rather than surrender their homeland, they formed one of the most effective military alliances in American Indian history. This was known as the Western Confederacy. Leaders including Little Turtle of the Miami, Blue Jacket of the Shawnee, Buckangahelas of the Delaware. They coordinated resistance against American expansion. Their objective was not to conquer the United States, but to preserve the Ohio River as the permanent boundary between American settlement and Indian territory. They were fighting for their homeland, right? And they were shockingly successful at first. Their military successes shocked the young republic. In 1791, General Arthur St. Clair marched nearly 1,400 American soldiers into present-day Ohio. The Confederated warriors launched a devastating surprise attack that annihilated much of his force. More than 600 American soldiers were killed. That's almost half the force there, making it the worst defeat ever suffered by the United States Army at the hands of American Indians. Hardly hear about that today, right? The disaster stunned the new nation's president, George Washington, right? Rather than abandoning the Northwest Territory, George Washington concluded that the United States required a professional standing army. So he appointed General Anthony Wayne to rebuild the military from the ground up. Wayne spent 2 years training, disciplining troops before finally confronting this Confederacy. The decisive battle came in 1794 at Fallen Timbers near present-day Toledo, Ohio. Wayne's well-trained army defeated the Confederated warriors, who retreated toward a nearby British fort, expecting assistance. Well, the British, unwilling to risk another war with the United States, refused to even open their gates. And the message was unmistakable. American Indians could no longer rely upon European powers to preserve their independence. The Treaty of Greenville the following year forced the tribes to surrender in this area. They surrendered much of present-day Ohio, opening the region to this inevitable, rapid American settlement. And it marked a turning point. While American Indians continued to resist expansion, the United States had demonstrated that it now possessed both the political will and the military capacity to impose its authority across the frontier. But still, the resistance didn't disappear. In the early 19th century, early 1800s, a remarkable movement emerged from the Shawnee brothers, two Shawnee brothers, one by the name of Tecumseh and one known as Tenskwatawa. Maybe I'm saying that name wrong. He was known as the Prophet, all right? And the Prophet preached a religious revival, urging American Indians to reject dependence upon American goods, abandon alcohol, and return to traditional ways of life. Tecumseh transformed this spiritual awakening among his people into an ambitious political project. Unlike earlier years, and earlier leaders who had focused primarily on defending their own tribes, Tecumseh, he envisioned a continent-wide confederation of American Indian nations. He argued that no single tribe possessed the authority to sell land because the continent belonged collectively to all American Indians. Only united resistance could halt American expansion. Traveling thousands of miles, Tecumseh recruited support from tribes stretching from the Great Lakes all the way to the Gulf Coast. His charisma, it impressed both allies as well as enemies. Even American officials acknowledged his extraordinary leadership. His movement alarmed Territorial Governor William Henry Harrison, who believed a united Indian Confederacy truly threatened the future of Western American settlement. In 1811, while Tecumseh was recruiting allies in the South, Harrison attacked the Confederacy's headquarters at Prophetstown. And although the Battle of Tippecanoe proved tactically inconclusive, Prophetstown was destroyed, and it weakened the movement, Tecumseh's movement, before it could reach its full strength. And when the War of 1812 erupted the next year between Britain and the United States, Tecumseh, he saw one final opportunity. So he allied his Confederacy with the British, hoping that a British victory might establish a permanent American Indian homeland in the Old Northwest. And for a time, this alliance proved remarkably successful. Tecumseh played a central role in the capture of Detroit, where without really even a major battle, he helped convince the American commanders that he faced overwhelming numbers. British General Isaac Brock admired Tecumseh so deeply that he called him the Wellington of the Indians, a famous European general. But the tide soon turned. In October 1813, American forces defeated the British at the Battle of the Thames in present-day Ontario. During the fighting, Tecumseh himself was killed, and his death, ultimately the Confederacy was built on him, so his death shattered the Confederacy that he had spent years building. With Tecumseh's fall, organized pan-Indian resistance east of the Mississippi River largely collapsed. The War of 1812 ended with no territorial changes between Britain and the United States, but its consequences for American Indians were profound. Britain effectively abandoned its long-standing native allies once again, and no foreign power remained willing or able to challenge American expansion into the interior of the continent. And now the American Indians were truly on their own, facing a westward expanding American empire that seemed determined to not stopping until they hit the Pacific Ocean. For the United States, this victory in the war, victory against the American Indians anyway, fostered a new sense of national confidence. Americans increasingly believed that their republic was destined to fill the North American continent. For American Indians, the years after 1815 really marked the beginning of a far more dangerous era. Military resistance had failed to stop the republic's growth. Some leaders of the Indians now concluded that survival, it really depended upon a different strategy now. Not war, it depended upon adaptation. They would adopt American farming methods. They would establish written constitutions. They would build schools and churches and demonstrate that Indian nations could flourish within the changing world. And many sincerely believed that such cooperation would secure their future. History would soon reveal how tragically mistaken that would prove. Hey folks, JB Shreve here. I hope you're enjoying this podcast episode as well as the wider series. If you're into learning, if you're into faith-based perspectives of history and of current events, I want to invite you to become an Into History Insider at our Patreon page. You can find the links to the Patreon group at theendofhistory.net or by going directly to patreon.com/JB Shreve. A Patreon supporter, for as little as $1 a month, you can access some of our past series all the way from the history of the Middle East, the history of India, how the world works in the School of International Relations, and many, many more podcast series, all of these that have been produced and published since the End of History began in 2012. That's patreon.com/JB Shreve. When you join, be sure to watch your inbox for an email from me where you'll find a link to join our End of History WhatsApp group that includes relevant discussions about today's current events. Again, head to patreon.com/JB Shreve and sign up as a Patreon supporter to the End of History today. The decades following the War of 1812 really marked a profound turning point in the relationship between the United States and American Indians. Military resistance had not entirely disappeared, but the possibility of stopping American expansion through force by the American Indians had largely faded, at least east of the Mississippi River. The United States emerged from the war with growing confidence, a rapidly expanding population, growing economy that was hungry for new land. And at the same time, many American Indian leaders, they reached the painful conclusion of their own. If warfare could no longer preserve their nations, perhaps adaptation could. Now, no tribe pursued this strategy more earnestly than the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Creek, and the Seminole, later known as the Five Civilized Tribes. That was the name they were given by the Americans. Although each nation possessed its own history and traditions, they increasingly adopted aspects of American society that U.S. Leaders had long encouraged. They developed commercial agriculture. They established schools. They published newspapers, embraced Christianity in significant numbers, and they created written constitutions modeled in part after that of the United States. The Cherokee became perhaps the most remarkable example of this effort. At the head of this effort was a guy by the name of Sequoyah. He's also known by the English name George Gist or George Guess. He was a member of the Cherokee Nation. He had little or no formal education. He wasn't literate in English, but he accomplished an intellectual feat unmatched by almost any individual in history. Convinced that the Cherokee language could be written, Sequoyah spent more than a decade developing a syllabary, a written system in which each symbol represents a syllable. Completed in 1821, the Cherokee syllabary enabled thousands of Cherokees to become literate within just a few years. So this new writing system helped preserve Cherokee culture, strengthened the nation's government, and made possible the publication of the Cherokee Phoenix, one of the first bilingual newspapers in North America. Sequoiah's achievement demonstrated that the Cherokee could embrace literacy. They could embrace education while preserving their own language, their own national identity. Under the leadership of Principal Chief John Ross, the Cherokee also adopted a constitutional government with executive, legislative, and judicial branches that closely resembled those of the United States. And many Americans had long argued that American Indians should abandon hunting and embrace farming, right? Educate their children, adopt European American customs. So the Cherokee did precisely that. But these accomplishments ultimately failed to protect them. And the reason lay not in anything that the Cherokee had done wrong, but in what the United States had actually become. During the first half of the 19th century, the American population exploded from roughly 5 million people in 1800 to more than 20 million by 1850. New settlers streamed westward in search of fertile farmland, economic opportunity, and as we've seen already in an earlier episode, cotton production transformed the Deep South into one of the world's richest agricultural regions, and the invention of the cotton gin made vast new lands enormously valuable. And unfortunately for many American Indian nations, those lands happened to include their ancestral homes. It's where they were living. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia in 1828, it only intensified the pressure against the Cherokee. Many white Georgians, they no longer viewed the Cherokee Nation as a neighboring government worthy of respect. Instead, they saw like an obstacle. They just saw the Cherokee people as an obstacle standing between themselves and valuable land. He's president now, Andrew Jackson, he shared much of this outlook. Jackson has spent much of his military career fighting American Indians, most notably during the Creek War and the War of 1812. Although he sometimes adopted American Indian children into his own household and maintained personal friendships with the individual tribal leaders, he firmly believed that Indian nations could not remain sovereign inside the expanding United States. In his view, removal west of the Mississippi River represented both a removal of the Indians west of the Mississippi River, represented both a practical necessity and, paradoxically, a humanitarian policy that would prevent endless frontier conflict. Many American Indians vehemently disagreed with that, of course. So did many Americans, missionaries, church leaders, senators, newspaper editors, even some frontier settlers condemned removal, the idea of removal, as a betrayal of solemn treaty obligations. One of the most outspoken opponents was Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee. He broke publicly with Andrew Jackson over this issue. Crockett warned that the United States was violating its own principles by driving peaceful nations from lands that they legally possessed. Well, despite this opposition, Congress narrowly passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. The law didn't itself order tribes to leave the area, but it authorized the federal government to negotiate treaties, exchanging eastern lands for territory west of the Mississippi. And in practice, however, these negotiations often occurred under overwhelming political and military pressure. The Cherokee people chose not to fight. Instead, they're adapting, right? They're adapting to the white man's ways. They're adapting to American ways. They chose not to fight, and instead they turned to the American legal system that they had worked so hard to emulate. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, the Supreme Court declined to hear their claim on procedural grounds. The following year, however, the court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia that the state of Georgia possessed no authority to impose its laws within Cherokee territory. Chief Justice John Marshall, he affirmed that the Cherokee Nation constituted a distinct political community whose treaty rights deserved federal protection. Now, for a brief moment, it appeared that the Cherokee had actually won this fight through the courts, but legal victory proved meaningless without political enforcement. Andrew Jackson, President Jackson, his administration declined to compel Georgia to comply with the court's rulings. Whether or not Jackson uttered the famous remark, he was reputed to have said, "John Marshall has made his decision. The Supreme Court Justice John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Andrew Jackson's administration made little effort to protect Cherokee sovereignty, and the lesson was devastating. The Cherokee had embraced literacy. They had embraced constitutional government. They'd embraced Christianity, agriculture, diplomacy, and even now the American court system, but none of it preserved their homeland. In 1835, a small minority of Cherokee leaders signed the Treaty of New Echota. I could be saying that wrong, Echota, without the authorization of Principal Chief John Ross of the Cherokee National Council. The vast majority of Cherokees rejected the agreement as illegitimate, but the United States Senate ratified it by a single vote. 3 years later, federal troops began forcing approximately 16,000 Cherokee from their homes. The resulting journey became known as the Trail of Tears. You've probably heard of this. The Trail of Tears. Families were rounded up into temporary stockades before beginning an approximately 800-mile march towards present-day Oklahoma. Poor planning, disease, inadequate food, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion turned the removal into a humanitarian catastrophe. Historians estimate that roughly 4,000 Cherokee people died during this journey, or from the conditions directly associated with it. If you travel through the South, through the Delta, you'll see signs marking the Trail of Tears, places where the Indians, the Cherokee people, had been marched on their way from the southeast to the Oklahoma Territory. The Cherokee weren't alone. The Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, the Seminole, they also experienced removal, though under differing circumstances. The Choctaw endured one of the earliest removals and suffered greatly from exposure and disease. The Creek lost millions of acres following internal divisions and military defeat. The Chickasaw negotiated more favorable financial terms but still surrendered their homeland. The Seminole resisted, led by figures like Osceola. Many Seminoles refused removal and fought the United States Army through the swamps of Florida during the Second Seminole War. The conflict itself actually became one of the longest and most expensive Indian wars in American history. Although thousands of Seminoles were eventually removed, others remained hidden in the Everglades with their descendants still alive today. These events, altogether, revealed an uncomfortable truth about American expansion. The fate of American Indian nations depended less upon how fully they embraced American institutions than upon whether Americans desired the land that they were living on. And the tragedy was therefore not simply one of cultural misunderstanding. It was also one of conflicting visions and views of sovereignty. American Indian nations viewed themselves as independent political communities connected to their ancestral land through history, through treaty, through identity. And increasingly, however, many Americans believed that no separate nations could permanently exist inside the boundaries of the United States. During the 1840s, as we've already seen, this belief acquired a powerful new name, Manifest Destiny. The journalist John L. O'Sullivan, he argued in 1845 that it was America's manifest destiny to spread across the continent. To many Americans, expansion promised liberty and economic opportunity and the extension of Republican government from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific. And millions sincerely believed they were participating in a noble national mission. For American Indians, however, manifest destiny often meant something entirely different. It meant that every successful American migration became pressure for another treaty. Every new territory became another demand for removal. Every discovery of fertile land or gold or commercial opportunity increased the likelihood that existing agreements could be discarded. The ideology itself didn't require violence. Manifest destiny didn't require violence, but it frequently justified it. A lot of people, a lot of Americans mistreated, oppressed, dealt injustices, even killed American Indians in the name of manifest destiny, their God-given right to take the land. Nowhere was this more tragically illustrated than in California. When the U.S. acquired California after the Mexican-American War in 1848, approximately 150,000 American Indians were living there, divided among dozens of distinct tribes and languages. Within months, the discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill unleashed one of the largest migrations in American history. We looked at that in our Manifest Destiny episode. Hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers flooded into California. Competition for land, for water, and resources quickly descended into widespread violence. Militia companies attacked villages. Civilians murdered American Indians with little fear of prosecution. Children were kidnapped and placed into forced labor. State and local governments often subsidized volunteer expeditions against Indian communities, while federal authorities proved unable, at times unwilling, to stop the bloodshed. Starvation compounded the violence as traditional hunting grounds disappeared and food supplies collapsed. Modern historians widely described what followed here in California among the Indians, nations, and tribes in this area as the California Genocide. Between 1846 and approximately 1873, California's American Indian population declined catastrophically through a combination of massacres, disease, forced displacement, kidnapping, and starvation. Although disease had long afflicted native populations after European contact, the violence of the Gold Rush era accelerated and intensified this demographic collapse. Horrible histories. So by 1850, the pattern that had emerged over the previous century had become unmistakable. American Indians had pursued many different paths. Some resisted militarily, like Tecumseh and Osceola. Some sought neutrality whenever possible. Others became indispensable allies of the United States in wars against rival tribes or foreign powers. And still others embraced education, Christianity, constitutional government, market agriculture, and diplomacy. No single strategy guaranteed survival. Some tribes successfully adapted and rebuilt their nations in the West. Others preserved important elements of their cultures, despite unimaginable hardship. Many continued negotiating with the federal government, establishing schools and churches and businesses, political institutions that even endure today. But cooperation alone often proved insufficient. Again and again, treaties that appeared permanent gave way to new demands whenever expanding settlement made Indian land more valuable. Nations that had trusted American promises frequently found those promises at best revised, at worst abandoned. This is what makes the story of American Indians before the Civil War so complex. It's not merely a story of conquest, nor simply a story of victimhood. It's a history of diplomacy and warfare, adaptation and resilience, remarkable political leadership, heartbreaking betrayal. American Indians were never just passive spectators to the rise of the United States. They fought, they negotiated, they compromised, they innovated, and they rebuilt in response to extraordinary pressure. But the rise of the American Republic unleashed forces that even the most capable leaders struggled to contain. Population growth and economic expansion, military powerful, the powerful belief that Americans had a manifest destiny to occupy the continent, combined to overwhelm the sovereignty of many Indian nations. By the middle of the 19th century, manifest destiny, it had really become more than a slogan. It had become the organizing principle of American expansion. For countless American Indians, it also became the force that transformed their world forever. Now, we're going to come back to the story of the American Indians after the Civil War, when we visit the Indian Wars of the second half of the 19th century in America, in the Southwest and the Western U.S., the New West after the Civil War. For now, it's important to recognize these wars and these Indians of the plains in the Southwest, many of them had seen their parents and ancestors already displaced by the young American nations. The Indians of the famous and mythological American West were the survivors of America's manifest destiny in the East. Their parents and their grandparents had already been pushed out, and their last stands in the American West that now paints the background of famous American Western and cowboy and Indian stories is really the story of the last stand of many of these peoples. I think it's also interesting to note that the story of the American Indian is the story of displacement and land redistribution. This is a phrase we don't often think of when we think of American history, but it's the real fact of our history. As the American Empire spread westward, land was redistributed. It was taken from the American Indians and then distributed to westward advancing American settlers, sometimes for pennies an acre, sometimes for free. That's a tactic of communist and socialist revolutions that we've seen over the last century in parts of Africa and Asia. It's not something we would normally consider within the story of American history, but that, again, is the fact of the matter. In our next episode, we're going to turn to the story of another group of the others. We'll turn to the story of Black Americans. While the story of the American Indians is the story of those who were here before America, the story of Black America is the story of those who were usually brought here against their will. This is an important part of the story to understand as we arrive to the American Civil War. That's all coming next in our series, The Empire, a 250-year American story. I'm J.B. Shreve, and you're listening to the End of History podcast, where we help believers make sense of their world and the history that built this world with intelligent, faith-based perspectives. We'll be back real soon.